Okay, good evening, everyone. My name is Marco Rossini. I'm professor of international law here at the Westminster Law School. Thanks for coming this evening. It's still a warm late summer evening, and it's a week of national mourning, so thanks for taking the time of coming here. It's the first event of our 2022-2023 series of events, and I'm personally delighted to have as our first speaker of the season Professor Daniel H. Joyner. Dan is a professor of the Elton B. Stevens Professor of Law at the University of Alabama School of Law. He was previously at Warwick University, and where he also got his PhD from, correct? And he's been also working on several projects for the U.S. State Department for some years now. He has a long list of influential publications in his pocket in several areas of public international law, although I think his main research interest is in weapons of mass destruction law. With a specific interest in nuclear weapons law. He has published no less than 3 books for Oxford University Press. The first one on weapons of mass destruction in general, the second on the Treaty on the Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons, and the latest one on the complicated relation that Iran has had with nuclear non-proliferation treaties. This evening is going to talk about arms control treaties. This week, if you want, we've been, for all that has happened in the UK, we've been looking back at what it has been, and we are also looking looking ahead to what is going to be, with perhaps some apprehension for the time of change that we will live in, not only in this country, but globally, but particularly, if you want, in this country these days. And I think Dan is going to undertake a similar exercise of looking back and looking ahead with regard to arms control law. Dan is going to talk for about 30 minutes, and then we'll take questions from the audience for the remaining time. But without further ado, Dan, always a pleasure to have you back. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Marco. Thank you to my dear old friend Marco. 2 of my edited books are with him. And he's the only person I have ever trusted enough to actually co-author something with. Co-authoring something is a process in which you really have to trust the other person. And he's the only person that I've ever trusted that much. So I'm personally very glad to be here.
It's a bit like moving in together.
Sort of, like moving in together, sort of. So I'm very glad to be here, and thank him for hosting me, and thank you all for coming out. I know it's maybe not the most exciting thing to do on a Monday night, but I appreciate your being here. This is my first academic address since the pandemic, so it's really nice for me to be back out on the road and meeting people and sharing ideas. Well, this talk has been titled, "What Next for Arms Control and International Law?" A nice forward-looking title. I think in order to get there, to the what next, we first have to talk about some definitions and some history. So let's talk about some definitions first. Arms control, what is it and what it is not? So I'm going to be focused on nuclear arms control and related treaties in this address. So let's talk about 3 different categories of obligations that states take upon themselves primarily in treaties with regard to nuclear weapons. They are non-proliferation obligations, arms control obligations, and disarmament obligations. These obligations are undertaken in a lot of different treaties, and often you will find in one treaty two or more types of these obligations. So in the Nuclear Nonproliferation Treaty, for example, we have nonproliferation obligations in Articles 1 through 3, and then we have disarmament obligations in Article 6. In the Nuclear Weapon Free Zone treaties, you have nonproliferation obligations, you also have disarmament obligations. So I'm not really categorizing treaties here so much as obligations that states take upon themselves, and they manifest themselves variously in treaties. But just so we can understand the different categories, when we talk about nuclear nonproliferation obligations, what we're usually talking about is obligations that are, in a multilateral sense, centered in the Nuclear Nonproliferation Treaty of 1970, Articles 1 through 3, and these are obligations that states take upon themselves to stop or at least slow the horizontal spread of nuclear weapons. I won't go into a big thing about the Nuclear Nonproliferation Treaty, but it was adopted at the height of the Cold War, and the superpowers at the time, for their own interests and strategic stability, wanted to stop in its tracks the horizontal proliferation of nuclear weapons to other actors because they thought that would destabilize the quite sensitive balance of power among them. So the Nuclear Nonproliferation Treaty's nonproliferation obligations are about that, trying to stop or at least slow more states and non-state actors from getting nuclear weapons. So we have the NPT. Again, we have nuclear weapon free zones. You can talk about testing treaties as part of the nonproliferation obligations also. So that's nonproliferation. It's centered in the NPT and its system that includes the International Atomic Energy Agency's safeguard system. It includes strategic trade controls, export controls, and things like the Nuclear Suppliers Group. All that is sort of the nonproliferation category of obligations. Arms control obligations with regard to nuclear weapons have more to do with the vertical proliferation, if you will, or vertical non-proliferation of nuclear weapons. Arms control agreements, in the sense that I mean them, arms control obligations, are those obligations entered into by only the United States and the Soviet Union, later Russia, bilaterally. We only see arms control agreements in that bilateral context. That doesn't mean that there couldn't be other dyads or triads of arms control obligations, but to this point, all we have is that particular dyad, the United States and the Soviet Union, later Russia. Arms control obligations, we'll talk about it more later, but right now I'm just trying to define. Arms control obligations in these treaties express a purpose to facilitate a reciprocally coordinated implementation of bilaterally agreed limits on the number of deployed strategic nuclear weapons and delivery systems. What I'm saying here is arms control obligations tend to cite as their purpose a carefully negotiated, detailed monitoring and verification system for reducing tensions, building trust, limiting the role and importance of nuclear weapons in the parties' strategic relationships, while maintaining their arsenals. So arms control agreements between the United States and the Soviet Union and Russia during the Cold War and afterwards were about getting agreements between the two parties that were complete with monitoring and verification protocols to allow for a sort of reciprocally staged reduction in the numbers and types of strategic nuclear weapons, those are the big ones, and delivery systems. Arms control obligations and treaties do do not talk about disarmament or going to zero. That's not what they're about. They were really a product of the Cold War to begin with, and their purpose was to stop an unbridled nuclear arms race. And in order to do that, set very specific limits, very detailed types of technologies that were covered, very detailed schedules, in order to get the two states, again, through a mutually monitored and verified system, get those numbers down. That's what arms control is about and is about. Finally, disarmament obligations. Disarmament obligations have as their sine qua non the idea of reducing nuclear weapons stockpiles to zero. It's conceptually distinct from arms control. Where do we see disarmament obligations? In a multilateral context, we see them most clearly in Article 6 of the NPT, the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. The obligation that I sometimes call word soup in Article 6 of the NPT, but that in its essence obligates all states parties to the NPT to move toward disarmament in good faith. We also see disarmament obligations in the nuclear weapon-free zones. And most recently, we see nuclear disarmament obligations in the 2017 Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. This is a treaty that is a United Nations treaty adopted by the UN General Assembly, was open for signature in 2017, came into force in 2020 or 21, I don't remember which one, but came into force within the last couple of years, has now 60-some treaty parties. And it is a nuclear weapons ban convention patterned after the Biological Weapons Convention, the Chemical Weapons Convention, but it includes in it a protocol for states that have nuclear weapons to join and through a supervised process to completely rid themselves of their nuclear weapons, to go down to zero. Now, on its face, it may be hard to distinguish between arms control treaties and disarmament treaties, or arms control obligations, disarmament obligations. And in fact, I see people who are supposedly experts writing in this area who don't seem to get the difference. But arms control obligations, I think you just have to remember, were a part of a moment in time between two particular actors, and they were about stopping a nuclear arms race and slowly lowering the numbers, particularly of deployed strategic nuclear weapons. And that continues to be the purpose of arms control. Whereas disarmament obligations, as we see them in NPT Article 6 and most recently in the TPNW, it's a separate agenda. That doesn't mean that there's no overlap between them. There is, in the sense that non-proliferation, arms control, disarmament, all these types of obligations do, of course, share a general purpose of trying to reduce the dangers of the use of nuclear weapons. So, of course, there's sort of a Venn diagram similarity in some ways, but at their essence, and this is the point I really want to make first, at their essence, non-proliferation obligations, arms control obligations, disarmament obligations are distinct in their purposes. So that's the first point I want to make, and it's something that I think is sometimes misunderstood, and I'll come back to that. Okay, well, with that definition, let's talk a little bit about history as it pertains to these the treaties that contain these obligations. So the NPT was signed at the height of the Cold War, 1968, came into force in 1970. Again, it was an important statement by the superpowers as they saw it to try to stop horizontal proliferation. At the same time, starting in 1972, we had the arms control project begin. In 1972, the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty and the SALT Treaty, Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty, were both signed. Those were the first big arms control treaties between the United States and the Soviet Union, and importantly started the climb down from the high of about 65,000 nuclear weapons shared between the United States and the Soviet Union at its peak. But over the next decades, through, again, the 1972 SALT and ABM treaties, the 1987 Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty, the 1991 START I Treaty, the 2003 SORT Treaty, and finally the 2010 New START Treaty, those arms control treaties, with, again, their very specific focus on certain technologies, their very detailed monitoring and verification provisions, they are rightly credited with helping the United States and the Soviet Union reduce the numbers, particularly of deployed, but also of possessed nuclear weapons, down to, I think I wrote it down here, from 65,000 at the peak to, gosh, I want to say it's more like 6,000 now. I think I have it there. 6,000 in all. Yeah, it's around about that, 6,000 in all in the world. That's a big drawdown. And arms control treaties were fundamental in facilitating that. So throughout the Cold War then, these arms control treaties are sort of the focus of nuclear weapons law. The NPT is there, but throughout the 70s, 80s, 90s, arms control is really the focus, or I should say at least through the 70s and 80s. Once the Cold War ends in 1991, there is a shift, and for many of you may be too young to remember, but there was a real sort of relief that maybe now we don't have to think about these nuclear weapons so much anymore. You know, the Soviet Union law, it's one, and now it's sort of a new era of cooperation, and so the Security Council is able to authorize the First Gulf War and the creation of the criminal tribunals, and there's sort of a new era of cooperative international law, and all this stuff about nuclear weapons sort of takes a back seat. Then September 11th happened, in 2001. And after that, for about 20 years, obviously this is painting with a broad brush, the focus of nuclear lawmaking and implementation shifted away from arms control and to nonproliferation. I mean, the NPT had been there for a long time, but particularly after September 11th, the war on terror, and the sort of the meeting up of the idea of weapons of mass destruction with global terrorism, all of that shifted the focus with regard to nuclear weapons away from arms control and into nonproliferation. And so it was all about the NPT and safeguards agreements, and that's when North Korea and Iran become the focus. Now, disarmament had been there all along. So I'm sort of trying to go through a historical map of emphasis on different obligations with regard to nuclear weapons. Disarmament had been there all along. It had been in the NPT in Article 6. It had been in nuclear weapon-free zones. And throughout this whole time, from the creation of the NPT through the early 2000s, I'm thinking of the NPT review conferences, the last one having adopted a final document is 2010. The issue of nuclear disarmament was always there, and it was always one of the most contentious issues at NPT review conferences and preparatory committee meetings. It was always there. It was always something that the non-nuclear weapon states, particularly the non-aligned movement, kept banging away at the nuclear weapon states that they weren't doing enough, So it was always there. But When we had, for example, the 1996 ICJ advisory opinion on nuclear weapons threat or use, but they then included disarmament. So it was always sort of there in the background. But just in the last 10 years or so, some things have happened that have changed the focus away from nonproliferation and back to arms control, and in some ways back to disarmament. It's been interesting to watch. I think that it really starts in 2014 with the initial Russian invasion of Ukraine and the annexation of Crimea. And at the same time, Chinese foreign policy under Xi Jinping starts to get more aggressive, maneuvers the South China Sea, etc. American foreign policy is always aggressive. But around about 2014, I think we start to see a slow sort of pivot back to great power thinking again in a way that we hadn't seen since the Cold War. All of a sudden, we're talking about Russian aggression, and Vladimir Putin is doing some nuclear saber rattling again. And of course, this really hits its peak when Russia invades Ukraine fully in 2021. So focus turns back to nuclear arms control, but also to disarmament when the TPNW is adopted in 2017. So through this sort of sketch of history, I guess I wanted you to see that these various kinds of obligations have had their sort of focus at different times in the past 50 years or so. We seem to be now turning back to a focus on nuclear arms control and nuclear disarmament. Now, the TPNW, I can't take a lot of time, you can look it up, but the TPNW I think is important. I think it's a sort of a reification of the will of most states. 122 states voted to adopt it as a UN treaty. I think it's an important reification of most of the world's view that nuclear weapons should be unlawful. I think it's an important step. But I think that it's important to view it as in the disarmament vein. It's in the vein of NPT Article 6, nuclear weapon-free zones, that idea of going to zero. So it's an important addition to that vein of obligations. It is not arms control. That's the sort of analytical point that I want to make. It is not about arms control. Again, arms control is not about going to zero. Arms control is about preserving strategic stability through very careful setting of limits on specified types of weapons technology in order to reduce the risk of nuclear war. So the TPNW, important, but it's disarmament. And that's what I think, that's the confusion that I see, that some proponents of the TPNW, well-meaning, again, I am in favor of the TPNW, but I think that some of the proponents of the TPNW think that now that we have the TPNW, we don't need arms control anymore. The states, the nuclear weapon states, well, they should just sign the TPNW. Fair enough. It's just, that doesn't seem likely to happen. Not one of the 9 possessors of nuclear weapons in the world show any interest in joining the TPNW. So while that may be a long-term goal, I don't think that we're at a point where we can just say, well, arms control is in the past. All right. Now let's talk about arms control. Now that we've sort of determined what it is and why we're now so interested in it, let's talk about why arms control, nuclear arms control, is in a crisis. I noted the history of arms control treaties, but what I didn't mention was that in 2002, the United States withdrew from and effectively terminated the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty. In 2019, the U.S. withdrew from and effectively terminated the 1987 Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty. And that means that the only nuclear arms control treaty left is the New START treaty that was adopted in 2010. In fact, it was supposed to terminate by its own terms in February of 2021, and it almost did. But when President Biden was elected in the United States, in my mind, thankfully, he and President Putin agreed, according to the treaty's term, to extend it for another 5 years. So now the New START treaty is set to expire in February of 2026. That may sound like a long time, but in terms of negotiating a successor, that is not a long time. It is a huge undertaking to negotiate a successor. And why do I say then we're in a crisis? One, that's the last standing nuclear arms control treaty. We don't have the anti-ballistic missile treaty anymore that was about missile shield. We don't have the intermediate nuclear forces treaty anymore. That was about keeping short to mid-range nuclear tipped delivery vehicles back further from borders. For example, the Russian-European border. These were important parts of the nuclear arms control architecture that are gone. And so now all we have is the New START treaty. What does New START do? Just quickly. New START, and I'm going to give you these facts so you can sort of see what I'm talking about. Disarmament. What do we have in disarmament law? MPD Article 6. You may have read it. It's 100 words or something like that. We've got the TPNW. It's an important treaty. It's about 4 pages long. New START, the only standing arms control treaty. 17 pages of treaty text, 165 pages of protocols, including definitions, schedules, and monitoring and verification provisions. That gives you an idea of the difference. It's a big difference in terms of what these treaties are doing. What New START does is limits deployed strategic nuclear weapons are limited to 1,550 each. Deployed ICBMs, that's intercontinental ballistic missiles, SLBMs, submarine launched ballistic missiles, nuclear tasked heavy bombers limited to 700 each, and deployed and non-deployed ICBM and SLBM launchers and heavy bombers limited to 800 each. That's what New START does. It is an important part of the sort of guardrails, I like that word, the guardrails of international relations, to have the United States and Russia limited to only that deployment. If New START terminates in February 2026, we will not have an international nuclear arms control agreement between the United States and Russia for the first time since 1972. That's why I think this area is in crisis, because we've lost some of the really important parts of that architecture, and the only one left standing is set to expire in 4 years if it's not, if a successor is not negotiated. Okay, I'm finally ready to talk about the future of arms control. I've taken some time to get there, but now you understand, I think, what I'm talking about when I say nuclear arms control and why it's important that we talk about the future. There are a lot of good ideas out there because we do have 4 years or so until New START expires. And there are a lot of good ideas floating around about what to do next. Of course, we're all cognizant that relations between the United States and Russia are at their lowest point. We often say that, but they seem to get lower and lower. Possibly their lowest point since the end of the Cold War because of Russia's unlawful invasion of Ukraine. And so there is some concern that maybe we can't get a new arms control regime. To that, I always say 1972 wasn't a great time either. And that's when the SALT Treaty and the ABM Treaty were negotiated. So I don't think we need good relations in order to negotiate arms control. In fact, the Cold War showed us that arms control can be done because of bad relations, frankly, because we see that we need it more. So I don't think that's a problem, but I do think we're going to have to be careful in what is proposed. For one thing, because there are so many other things going on now in the sort of general area of nuclear weapons. What I mean is, it would be fairly straightforward to negotiate a successor to the New START Treaty that just focuses, as it and its previous ones did, the previous arms control treaties, fairly straightforward to focus just on deployed strategic nuclear weapons and delivery systems. Fairly straightforward, even if we just re-upped the same numbers that I just read off to you. Fairly straightforward. I personally think that that's got the best chance of passing politically through the US Senate, for example. That would be the easiest thing to do. But there are a lot of other issues floating around. I'll give you a few of them. Tactical nuclear weapons. I can't go into the technical definitions, but tactical nuclear weapons are the smaller yield ones. And Russia has a huge quantitative advantage in the number of tactical nuclear weapons that they possess. But they've never been part of a nuclear arms control treaty. But there is some feeling now that we can no longer just look at the strategic nuclear weapons, that we have to include those tactical nuclear weapons. There's some doctrines going on there about use of tactical nuclear weapons. That's actually what many are afraid could happen if Putin feels that he's losing the war in Ukraine, the use of tactical nuclear weapons. So that's one issue that's in the mix. U.S. missile defense is always something that Russia would like to include in nuclear arms control because it's a real thorn in their side. Particularly U.S. missile defense systems in Europe. They've been complaining about those for decades. So that's something Russia would like to include. We've got all sorts of emerging technologies that we really don't know exactly what their applications will be, but like hypersonic delivery vehicles. That's new. Then there are things that we don't even totally understand what their applications would be, like artificial intelligence and like, I can't even think of them. Robotics and artificial intelligence and these sort of emerging technology areas that we don't really even know yet exactly what their applications will be. But some people say we need to sort of nip that in the bud and start negotiating about that too. The other thing the U.S. is quite keen to include in the next round of nuclear arms control agreements is China. All of the arms control agreements up till now, as I said, have been that U.S.-Russia dyad. But the United States in the past few years has really strongly, at least under the Trump administration, and I haven't really seen any change in the Biden administration, really thinks that if there's going to be new nuclear arms control agreements, that China should be included, because China's, even though of course it's hard to tell in precise terms, but it does seem that China has been improving both quantitatively and qualitatively its nuclear weapons arsenal, and so there's a feeling in the United States that that ought to be included. So there's a lot going on to try to pack into some new treaty on nuclear arms control. We can maybe talk about this in the questions, but I'll tell you my own view at this time. My own view at this time is that we need to focus on a successor to New START, even if it means just keeping the agreed limits that we have now on deployed strategic nuclear weapons and delivery vehicles. I feel that that is such an important guardrail for international relations and continues to be important to prevent an all-out strategic nuclear weapons arms race. I think they're still serving the role that they served in 1972. And I think that is so important that we ought to do that first, get a successor in place. Again, I think that's also the most politically easy thing to do. And as we're doing that, in parallel, I think there's some very interesting ideas out there to do with what sort of agreements could be possible on some of these other issue areas. And what I mean by that is going outside of the legally binding treaty paradigm. In non-proliferation arms control, we're quite familiar with non-legally binding regimes like the Nuclear Suppliers Group and the Missile Technology Control Regime, and more recently the JCPOA, the Iran nuclear deal. This is old hat. It's not something brand new. I think that for the successor to START, we should still focus on that being a treaty mostly because of the monitoring and verification provisions that have to take place under it. I think it's important for those to be legally binding. But when we talk about tactical nuclear weapons, I think that it may well be advisable to start there with some sort of a non-binding accord on transparency and risk reduction that would at least get the United States, Russia, and China talking more formally and introducing transparency protocols about the subject of tactical nuclear weapons. I think that's the best we can do to begin with. Missile defense, that's a tough one for the United States because, and particularly in Congress, there are strong feelings about missile defense in Congress. Some of it has to do with budget and who's making missile defense technologies in my state. But some of it also is this sort of belief that we need it, even though the test record is not very good for ballistic missile defense. It's like it's trying to hit one bullet with another bullet, and it works about half the time. But there's still just a really strong commitment to ballistic missile defense in the United States. That's going to be a tough one. But I think the trouble with the INF, the reason the United States withdrew was because the United States said that Russia was cheating, and they probably were. But it seems to me that we might be able to recreate something like the INF that is just focused on the European theater. Because a lot of the reason that I think the United States really wanted out of the INF was not to do with the European theater, it was to do with the Far East, China and North Korea, and not being able to place intermediate nuclear forces around that area. So I think there's something to be said for working on, maybe at first, a legally non-binding accord on missile defense focused in the European theater. With China, I'm open to, I think that's a tough one, because China so far has expressed zero interest in wanting to be involved in nuclear arms control. And persuasively, they say, well, the U.S. has roughly 5,400 nuclear weapons, Russia has roughly 6,000 nuclear weapons, China has around 350. And so what exactly, this is what China will say in paraphrase, what exactly do you want us to agree to? I mean, do you want to come down to where we are first and then we can talk about it? And it's a persuasive argument. It's hard to say that China ought to be at sort of the same table as the United States and Russia. So that's a tough one. I guess I think that may be a losing battle diplomatically. And China is involved in the P5 process of publishing statements. That may be all we can expect right now going forward. So let me finish up. I've given you this sort of taxonomy and history as a way to understand why I think we do need to focus on nuclear arms control now, resuscitating efforts to create a successor for New START, and start, even if in a legally non-binding way, to come up with new agreements that interject transparency and risk reduction into these other areas. But in my opinion, we ought to push first and foremost for a legally binding successor to the START agreement, because I think it's too important to have that somehow wrapped up with other things and not get done. I think it's too important a guardrail. So I would be in favor of first focusing on a legally binding treaty as a successor to New START for deployed strategic nuclear weapons and delivery vehicles, and then look at non-legally binding, perhaps, agreements on missile defense and on tactical nuclear weapons as ways of enhancing transparency and risk reduction. So I think I'll stop my comments there and would be happy to take questions or comments.